The relationship between knowledge and truth is one of the foundational questions when we think about the first issue in our series on epistemology, which is the question of what actually is knowledge. What does it mean for a belief to be true? And why is truth considered a necessary condition for somebody to have knowledge? What role does truth play in our understanding of what it means to know something? Ultimately, these are the questions that we're going to be examining in this lesson, focusing firstly on the core relationship between knowledge and truth, looking at various different theories of truth, the coherence theory of truth, pragmatic theory of truth, the importance of truth in our understanding of knowledge, and the epistemic value of truth at the end of this lesson. So, fundamentally, at its core, the connection between knowledge and truth is relatively straightforward. For someone to know a proposition, for somebody to have knowledge of that proposition, to be said to have knowledge of that proposition must be true. This leads to the assumption that knowledge requires truth. If a person believes something that is false, then on this classical account, they cannot be said to have knowledge of it, that they cannot be said to know it, no matter how strongly they believe it or how well justified their belief might be. So, for example, someone could believe that the earth is flat. They could be one of these conspiracy theorists, and they could feel very, very strongly about this belief. And they could be very, very well justified in that belief. They might have all crazy, wacky theories that shows exactly what they mean about why the earth is actually flat. But because that is actually not true, they do not have knowledge of that belief. Okay, they just have a belief in something, and that belief is not true. The idea of knowledge is something that is deeper than just a mere belief. Believing something can be the result of whatever factors. It could be the result of conspiracy, it could be the result of somebody being fed misinformation, but it is not actually knowledge. You can't have knowledge that the earth is flat because the earth is not flat, okay? And if there's any flat earthers that are watching, I'm sorry, but that is the case. And no, I'm not going to debate you on that question. So, according to the classical definition of knowledge, truth is one of the essential components. The idea of justified true belief, the tripartite theory of knowledge, requires truth, justified true belief. And so truth is foundation upon which knowledge is built. A true belief is the necessary condition for knowledge, but it is not enough by itself. You have to also have justification. You must also be able to justify why you believe that thing, and that thing has to be true. That you have to have a belief in something. You have to, that belief has to be true. It has to be a true fact about the world, and you must be justified in that belief. That is what the idea of justified true belief actually refers to. So, while some argue that truth is necessary for knowledge, it is not necessarily sufficient. This means that a belief can be true without being knowledge. So while you can't have knowledge without truth, you can have belief being true without knowledge. This is part of the classic Gettier problem, which shows that a belief can be true and justified, but still not yet qualify as knowledge in some cases. These cases show that truth is an essential aspect of knowledge, but a deeper exploration of the relationship between belief, justification, and truth is required to fully understand what knowledge entails. We spoke about that previously in its own separate video. So let's examine truth then in more detail. Let's examine truth as a more separate factor. Philosophers have proposed various different theories of truth to explain what it means for a belief to in fact be true. Now, each theory attempts to clarify the conditions under which a belief can be said to correspond to the facts of the world. These theories shape how we think about knowledge, And the major theories of truth include the correspondence theory of truth, the coherence theory of truth, and the pragmatic theory of truth. Let's begin first with the correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory is one of the oldest and most widely accepted views about truth itself. According to this theory, a belief or a proposition is true if it corresponds to or matches the way the world actually is. So there is a correspondence between the belief in something and of the proposition and the actual reality of that proposition. So, for example, if I was to say that I believe the sky is blue, this belief will be true, according to the correspondence theory, if and only if, in the actual world, the sky is indeed blue. It corresponds to the reality of the world. The truth of the proposition is therefore determined by whether the state of affairs described by the proposition exists in reality. The correspondence theory ties truth directly to the objective world that we live in. It suggests that truth is an external factor of the mind. It is independent of individual perspectives or individual interpretations. If a person was colorblind, for example, and they saw that the sky was in fact green, they would be incorrect because that does not correspond with the truth of the world. Correspondence theory does, in fact, face some challenges. So it faces the challenge when considering abstract concepts or maybe non-empirical truths. What about moral truths? What about mathematical truths? How do they correspond to the actual world? There are some theories in mathematics that don't really have much correspondence to the physical world. So there are theories of quite abstract and quite complicated areas of mathematics that aren't corresponding to the real world. Now, without getting into a sort of deeper debate about whether or not maths was invented or discovered, that's a philosophy of mathematics question for a future time. There are historically examples of mathematicians basically inventing things and inventing theories that are sophisticated and interesting and seem to be mathematically coherent, but at the time didn't really correspond to the real world. So some might argue, for example, that string theory is mathematically consistent, it makes sense, all the math seems to work, but string theory for some people just doesn't exist. There's no real empirical evidence that string theory is real. There's just the sort of internal mathematics behind it. Things like imaginary and complex numbers originally started out as similar to that kind of concept, as a sort of a fun mathematical exercise that derives some interesting coherent concepts. Now, it later turned out that imaginary numbers and complex numbers did in fact correspond to concepts within the world, and we use in quantum physics and in things like engineering all the time. And so that debate leads to the sort of invented versus discovered conversation, but we'll get to that in future lessons. But ultimately, what I'm trying to get at here is that there are certain abstract concepts like string theory or non-empirical concepts like morality and moral truths which do not correspond directly to physical states or affairs within the actual world. So by contrast then, we can have a theory of truth that takes a different approach, and this may be the coherence theory of truth. Instead of relating truth to an external reality, the coherence theory suggests that a belief is true if it fits coherently within a system of beliefs. According to this view, very simply, the truth of a proposition is determined by how well it integrates and how well it coheres with other beliefs within a larger, internally consistent framework. So, in a scientific theory, let's say the truth of a proposition such as water boils at 100 degrees C. This can be determined not by empirical observation, as would be seen by the correspondence theory of truth, but how well it fits into the broader corpus of scientific knowledge. If the proposition is consistent with other established facts and theories, then it can be considered to be true. It coheres to the rest of science. I should say water boils at 100 degrees C at sea level. Bear that in mind. Now, coherence theorists argue that truth is a product of our cognitive and social systems. Truth in this view, then, is not something that is external and objective, but it is instead relational and internal, and dependent on the coherence of a belief within a given system of thought, within a given web of thoughts. Now, you can have a criticism of this, for example, that coherence theory could be seen as having a belief system that is internally coherent, yet nevertheless false. For example, a belief system that is built around a false premise could still exhibit an internal consistency, but fail to correspond to reality. Anybody who has engaged in and studied and thought about conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists might come to this same conclusion. It could be internally consistent that the Earth is flat, for example, or that we never went to the moon, or any of these different kinds of conspiracies, or more dangerous conspiracies about things like medical misinformation. And it might seem coherent, but it would be coherent on the basis of a faulty premise, or on the basis of premises that have not been established. So often conspiracy theories will build on theories of knowledge, and will build on making claims that don't really have an empirical basis. I know, crazy statement to make, but works off an assumption. So an assumption of anti-establishmentism, for example, an assumption that the government is trying to stop you from knowing the truth. And on the basis of that assumption, things can then be worked into that assumption, and everything that could challenge that particular conspiracy theory would still fit into this broader narrative, because it can just be hand-waved away as being the government covering something up. So wherever there is inconsistencies or lack of coherence within a conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theorists will always be able to resolve that, because they are not coming at that conclusion on the basis of trying to find what the belief is. They already have what their belief is, and they're trying to get the evidence to fit that belief. So they sort of flip it round the other way. So this ultimately leads to conspiracy theories, and it leads to a coherent system of thought and a coherent system of knowledge, because basically everything is unfalsifiable and all roads lead to Rome and all these different kinds of things, but is ultimately based on a false premise. Finally then, the pragmatic theory of truth is a theory we've already explored in the previous lesson. People like William James and Charles Sanders Peirce defines truth in terms of the practical consequences associated with them. According to this view, a belief will be true if it works or proves useful in practice. Simple as that, really. Truth is determined by the success or by the effectiveness of a belief when applied to a real-life situation. If I had a scientific inquiry, if I was to have a hypothesis, and I want to try and conclude that this hypothesis is true, we might say, according to a pragmatic theory, that it is considered true if it leads to successful predictions and practical applications. If a scientific theory leads to tangible results, such as predicting behavior of a physical system, then it can be regarded as being true. This presents a theory of truth that is not fixed or absolute, but something that may evolve on the basis of experience, of inquiry, and of utility. What is true is what enables individuals to effectively navigate the world and to solve problems. The pragmatic theory, therefore, emphasizes the dynamic and practical nature of truth, but it can be criticized for potentially making truth too subjective. One of the things that we really, really would like, especially in this sort of modern world, at least in my opinion, is having certain truths that we can know for sure to be objectively the case, without getting too postmodern about it. And so a pragmatic theory of this nature can be seen as making something too subjective, as what is useful or successful for one person or one group may not be useful or successful for another. If, for example, you have a scientific theory, then we're thinking about understanding a hypothesis as true or not true on the basis of the results that we get. But that could just mean that we can alter the parameters of the results that we want, and this can therefore lead to a situation in which you may conclude truth on the basis of it adhering to and being coherent with that result that you would like. But of course, that is completely subjective and it's completely arbitrary potentially. What is to say that this result in particular is the one that you want to happen? Well, you'd have to explain why that is the case, and then you'd have to explain why the case, and all this kind of stuff. It also raises the question of whether something can be considered true if it works in some context but doesn't work in others. If I can replicate a theory once in one context, but I can't replicate it in a different context, does that mean, according to pragmatic theory, that it was true in that context and false in the other? Or does it mean that it was just not true at all, and it was and this was a false start, a false point? All of these things, of course, cause problems for coming up with a coherent system of understanding scientific inquiry. So we've seen in this lesson so far the importance of truth, or at least the different theories of truth that provide different ways of understanding what it means for a belief to be true. However, in the context of knowledge, the central importance of truth remains unchanged. Truth plays several crucial roles for our understanding of what knowledge is and how we come to derive knowledge. As previously mentioned, truth is a necessary condition for understanding what knowledge is. For any belief, according to the justified true belief theory, for any belief to count as knowledge, it must also be true. If the belief is false, it cannot qualify as knowledge, no matter how well justified or how strongly believed it is. In this sense, then, truth is considered to be a foundational component of knowledge. So, a belief in a false proposition, as I've mentioned earlier, that the earth is flat, for example, cannot be considered knowledge no matter how justified the belief might be. A person might have good reasons for understanding that the earth is flat. They might look on the basis of observations, for example. They might see a big field, or they might go and look at the sea, and they might see, well, look, it's very, very flat to me. It looks very flat to me, so I'm justified in this belief that the earth is flat. That is not knowledge because it's based on a false proposition. It is a false claim. There is no truth behind that claim, regardless of how well justified you might be. For knowledge to be not only true but justified, there must also be a reliable method or process for which that ensures the belief is in fact true. Truth provides the standard by which we access the reliability of the process that leads to a justified belief. So, for example, scientific methods of observation and experimentation and logical reasoning are designed to align beliefs with the truth of the external world. When these methods are reliable, they can lead to true conclusions. They provide a strong justification for knowledge claims. And so for an epistemologist, there is a certain epistemic value in the idea of truth. Truth has intrinsic value in our pursuit of knowledge. We seek to understand and to explain the world, and truth is the ultimate goal of this endeavour. The pursuit of truth, should I say, is not just about the accumulation of beliefs but about specifically aiming for accurate and reliable representations of reality. Essentially, what we're trying to do is in the collection of knowledge and in the acquisition of knowledge is to try and be able to represent in our minds what reality is, to try and understand the world. Knowledge is valuable because it brings us closer to truth, and truth in turn provides a foundation for practical action, ethical decisions, personal growth, scientific discovery.